Each year at the Delaware Standardbred Owners Association annual banquet, a very special President's Award is presented. This year's honoree was retired Representative William Oberle, who served the people of Delaware for 34 years. Mr. Oberle was incredibly instrumental in putting together the Horseman's Redevelopment Act, which started 25 years ago. But we have not forgotten what he's done, and we continue to be very grateful for his efforts.
Bill, the President's Award is like a big deal. So when you found out that you were going to get this from our DSOA president, Anna Marcano, what were your feelings?
It was a little overwhelming, and you and I talked about that. I'm not generally comfortable. I just shared this with the governor as well. You know, I never quite understood the concept of getting an award for doing the right thing. And, you know, again, I'm just not entirely comfortable. I appreciate it. I'm humbled by it. But, you know, at times I just feel awkward about it. So.
I'll tell you, for somebody who was a representative in, our Delaware government for 30-some years, he is the hardest person to find a picture of, like, out there, like Googling, social media. And again, like we had said, you're probably the most private public figure maybe ever.
Yeah, and that's certainly planned. I mean, I've never been comfortable in the limelight. I was never comfortable while I was in public office, except when I was on the floor of the House. That was where I felt at home. And perhaps it's because I felt I could control the process. And I tend to be rather introverted and very private, so sometimes it's difficult when you're in public office to do that.
So just so you guys know, this is like kind of pretty awesome because Bill is on our show, all right? Yeah? Had to pull a couple exclusive, that's right. Had to put the pink hair in, pull a couple strings. So, all right, we, of course, are honoring you because when the Horseman's Redevelopment Act came into place, you were a huge force behind it. Why did you think it was important?
Well, for several reasons. The governor and I both come from Claymont. We call ourselves clay monsters. It was a blue-collar, sometimes rough neighborhood. And there weren't, I would say money was sometimes difficult to come by. And then in 1981, I claimed a horse, less tired, in Harrington with two of my friends. And we knew nothing about horses or horse racing. We just wanted to have a racehorse. We knew which end the feed came in and what came out the other end. But we were standing there with this racehorse, and none of us knew what to do with it. I mean, we had a halter, and we were standing in Harrington, and a driver by the name of Ray Small, I think he was Canadian, came up to us and said, "What are you guys going to do with your horse?" And he agreed to take him for 50% of the purse. And darn if Les didn't win his first race. I think it was 212 and a piece at Harrington. That's how long ago it was. And I was hooked ever since. But the story behind the story is I stayed active for a number of years in the race industry as an owner, certainly not as a horseman. But I realized, you know, when you're working 16, 18 hours a day with no guarantee of income, particularly at the lower purse structures, doing overnights and maybe not even winning a nickel with all those outlays, it seemed like this was if you will, a blue-collar area that needed attention. And as the purses diminished, clearly the business was struggling. And a lot of the owners, the trainers, drivers, it was generational. You were talking about, 2, 3, 4 generations of families. That's important. I mean, you need to preserve an industry that has that much background and culture in the state of Delaware. So that was really the impetus for it all.
And you know what's so fabulous is that the result from everything has been more jobs, and we're not talking about just the grooms or the trainers and the drivers, everything that's happening at Dover Downs and Harrington Racing, all those jobs, thousands of them actually, and the trickle-down effect. So, I mean, that's got to make you feel good. I mean, you really made the right, the right decision, really backing this and putting this in place.
Well, the multiplier effect, I mean, when you look at this industry, is extremely high in terms of job creation. And the tangential effect is the preservation of open space. I mean, that is a big component of all this. Many of these farms wouldn't exist today. They'd be tract housing, which would have been a sin, quite honestly, to have that take place. So that was part of the lodging. Governor Carper, who's a very close friend of mine and remains a close friend, allowed the bill to go into law without his signature. He realized that it was a good thing to do, but he was under political pressure from all sides. 2 years afterwards, he approached me and he said, if I'd known it was going to be this good, particularly from the open space perspective, he said, I'd have had slot machines put in the median along Route 1 outside of Rehoboth, so when they're jammed up in traffic, they could play the darn things. So, it all worked out.
No, that's great. I love that story. That's awesome. Now, you are retired now. Well, you're retired from the House of Representatives anyway, so what are you doing? How do you pass your time?
Well, right after I retired, the troopers approached me, and I had worked very closely with law enforcement for years. And they asked me if I would represent them in state government. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll do it pro bono for a year. We'll see how it works out. And it's now been 10 years that I work for the Troopers Association. And they're great men and women, and, they have a hard job. And, we endeavor to make sure they have the tools and things that they need to perform their duties.
Oh my goodness! I mean, that's huge. We really need to have people out there because it's one of those jobs that not everybody wants to be a trooper. That's for sure. Right. So I mean, so much respect to everything that they do and everything you're doing. So that's awesome.
Thank you.
Now, we also heard that you might be hosting a couple podcasts. Is that true? What are they about, and where can we find you?
Well, there was one podcast recently I did, and this was another interest of mine that I always had, again, maybe it was part of my upbringing. I hated to see people who didn't get an even break. So one of my pet peeves were people being discriminated against based on their sexuality. So the podcast recently that I did was revisiting, along with Speaker Schwarzkopf, because he was actively involved, in an anti-discrimination act that we passed to prevent that sort of discrimination.
Wow, that's interesting. So now, are you continuing to do podcasts then? Like, can people?
Well, that is the most recent, that I've done, and I fought that too. I really didn't want to do it, but I was glad I did afterwards because I liked the format. It was comfortable, and it was a back and forth, so it worked out well.
All right. Hey, you guys out there watching, we need a rating campaign to Bill Oberle here because I think he and I should be doing a podcast on something. I don't know. It could be anything from pink hair to harness racing. We don't know yet, but write in and give your support. So
glad to do a podcast with you.
Oh, so much fun. Thank you. And it's so interesting. I loved hearing your perspective because this is the first time we've really been able to talk about this. I love it. Thank you.
I have unfortunately avoided you in the past, but I've avoided a lot of the media, so it's you're in good company. So.
All right. Okay. At least he's honest, right? Thank you again.
Thank you, Helen.